The Templeton Twins by Ellis Weiner. Please turn to page 69 and 70 for chapter 6. When you hear the bell, be sure to go to the top of the next page to continue reading along. Let's begin. Chapter 6, The Handsome Man. The Templeton twins' new home was a worn but comfortable old-fashioned house of dark gray wood. Cracked leather shuttered framed with windows and made them look like intelligent squinting eyes. There was a nice porch in the front and a small fenced-in backyard in which Casey could bark at squirrels in a ridiculous fashion. 2 nights after they had moved in, following an early dinner, Professor Templeton said, "Well, I'm off to give my lecture. Would you two like to come along?" Now, neither John nor Abigail was particularly interested in personal transport mobilities or the problem of linkages. In fact, they didn't know what any of that meant. Neither do you, of course. And although this will surprise you, neither do I. But the twins were excited at the idea that their father would be in front of an audience, so they happily said yes. They'd love to join. They accompanied the professor to the biggest auditorium at the Institute in Jim and Darrell Hall. When they got there, they were happy to see a good crowd of students, teachers, and local people from the town had assembled to hear the professor speak. The twins sat in the front row and felt very proud of their father. It is possible you have heard some of Professor Elton Templeton's inventions. He invented the Battery-Operated Toothpick, also known as the TOB, the self-adjusted chromatic shoehorn, the so-called SACS, the husk-removing garlic press, which cooks refer to as the HRGP, and the adjusted-o-matic drive board, known informally as the AOMDB, and the self-tensioning bookends, the STB, beloved of librarians throughout the universe. To the students and teachers at TBIT, most of whom were or wanted to be engineers and inventors too, Professor Templeton was a star, and the audience for his lecture that evening was big, happy, and excited. On the stage was a stand with a little light and a microphone. Behind it was a huge white screen. A young man introduced the professor, and everyone applauded. The twins were thrilled. Thrilled! The professor thanked everyone, and then the lights went down. As he stood at the stand and spoke into the microphone, a series of pictures of his inventions, his sketches, and his calculations appeared on the screen. Finally, to conclude the lecture, the professor spoke about his current invention, the personal one-man helicopter, the POMH. This was a device you strapped onto your back, like a knapsack, and it held a motor, controls, and those fan-like turning things that are called rotors. The personal one-man helicopter allowed the person using it to fly both up and down and over distances. Such a device, the professor hoped, would eliminate the need for many cars and would help people to get where they were going faster and more cheaply. John and Abigail knew all about this invention, of course, because their father had discussed it with them over the years and asked their opinion about it and shown them his drawings. So the things he told the audience were not new to them. But they enjoyed hearing the audience laugh and applaud for their father when he said a funny or clever thing. When the lecture was over, Professor Templeton asked the audience if they had any questions. 4 or 5 people asked about the different problems the professor was trying to solve with the POMH. Would work safely and not be too expensive to produce. The professor answered the questions and the people applauded again. Then a man raised his hand and stood up. He was 6 feet tall, beautifully dressed, in an elegant tailored black suit, a bright white shirt, and a pale blue tie, and very handsome. In fact, wherever he went, people could be heard whispering to each other, "My, what a handsome man!" "Yes?" Professor Templeton said. "Do you have a question?" "I have several questions, Professor Elton Templeton," the man said. "My first question is, don't you recognize me?" The professor frowned, squinted at the man, and shielded his eyes from the stage light, but finally shook his head. "I'm afraid I don't recognize you," he said. "Is there any reason I should?" "Oh yes, there is every reason you should," the man said. "But let me ask my next question. My next question is, how dare you?" The people in the audience gasped. Abigail and John gave each other a look that was wordless. Yikes. Professor Templeton looked puzzled. "How dare I what?" he said. "How dare you pretend that the personal one-man helicopter is your invention?" The man said angrily, "When you know full well it is really my idea." The professor became even more confused. "Well, I mean to say," he stammered, "I don't think the idea for a one-person, an arsenal transportation device is any one person's idea. Many different people have had similar ideas over the years. This one is mine. But I mean to say, people have been talking about one-person jetpacks for 50 years. The professor went on. "I mean, my goodness, Leonardo da Vinci himself drew sketches of a one-man helicopter over 500 years ago." "Not like mine," the handsome man yelled. "My idea was put it in a knapsack. That's what I told you. Put it in a knapsack." "Oh, but that is quite impossible. We have never met." "We have indeed met, sir." The handsome man extended one beautifully jacked arm and pointed a strapped, stabbing finger at Professor Templeton. "When you were my professor at Elysian University 13 years ago." At this, everyone in the room fell completely silent. If there had been a band in the auditorium, it would have played something stern and dramatic, such as dum 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 dum. All eyes were on Professor Templeton, as he stared hard at the handsome man. The professor thought and thought and thought until finally he said, "Are you Mr. Dean?" "I am," the handsome man said with an attitude of triumph. "I am Dean D. Dean." The professor nodded. Then he said, "Mr. Dean, you may or you may not have told me to put it in a knapsack 13 years ago. I don't remember." "Well, I do. But what I must remember is that it is very common for different people to have the same idea. It happens all the time." "I said put it in a knapsack. I said put it in a knapsack." "What matters," the professor said, now speaking to the crowd and looking directly at the twins in the front row, "is not what idea you have, but what you do with your idea." The audience clapped at that very wise observation. The twins applauded as hard as they could, but the handsome man waved his arms wildly around until everyone fell silent again. "Oh, really?" he said. "Oh, is that so? Oh, is that the case?" "Well, yes," the professor said, "it is." "Look, Professor," said Dean D.D., "just because your wife died and everyone feels sorry for you doesn't mean I didn't say put it in a knapsack 13 years ago." The audience was astounded. Everyone felt that it was extremely rude and even nasty for Dean D.D. to mention the professor's wife in that way. Finally, the professor said, "I will tell you what I do remember about you, Mr. Dean. You are the only student to whom I have ever given a failing grade. You stole my ideas. I did no such thing. I don't steal ideas. First, because it is unethical. Second, because I have plenty of ideas of my own." The audience burst into applause and cheered, and the young man who had introduced the professor came out onto the stage, stood beside the professor, and looking at Dean D. said into the microphone, "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to leave the auditorium." The audience applauded even more. Dean D. became extremely angry. He again pointed a finger at the professor and yelled, "This isn't over, Professor Elton Templeton." With a snort, he forced his way past all the people sitting in his row without even saying "excuse me" or "sorry." "My, what a handsome man," someone whispered, "but so rude." Then he marched furiously up the aisle and out the auditorium. For a moment, everyone was silent. Then Professor Templeton said quietly, "Well, I imagine that concludes tonight's presentation." At this, the entire audience leaped to its feet and applauded and whistled and cheered. The professor thanked them with a little nod and a wave. He caught the eyes of Abigail and John and nodded to them too. Please hold your place with your finger in your book as we click on Part 2 of Chapter 6.